Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week I'm talking to Mike McQuaid. Mike is one of the maintainers of Homebrew. If you have a Mac, you know, and if you don't have a Mac, then we'll get into what it is. But yeah, cool stuff. Calling in from Scotland. Is that what you said?
Yep, Edinburgh in Scotland.
Very cool. I have some Scottish in me. I have a whole bunch of other European countries in me too. But anyway, do you want to just jump in and let us know what else people ought to know about you before we get rolling?
Sure. So yeah, as Charles nicely said, I'm Mike McQuaid. He said my name perfectly, which is not always something you can rely on, which is very nice. So I'm currently working on Homebrew in my, volunteer life, spare time sort of stuff. Worked on it for 15 years. Since 2009, I got involved. I think I was the third person to get a commit bit on the project, and I'm the only one still standing after that time. And I'm like the project leader, which basically means I'm sort of an elected figurehead / tech lead, etc. So in my kind of outside of my Homebrew life, work-wise, I'm working right now. Started a company last year with some ex-GitHub people called Workbrew, where we're working on commercializing some stuff around Homebrew and basically building the features that kind of small, medium, large companies need that Homebrew does not have, so that they can work in the way they want to work while Homebrew plays nicely with that. And then before I was working here, I worked at GitHub for 10 years. And I left as a principal engineer last year, and I was bounced all over the place there, but particularly, I guess, focused on developer experience stuff and open source and scratching my own itches, basically.
Very cool. Yeah, I've known a few people who've worked at GitHub. I also remember way back in the day when Chris and Tom put their heads together and started the thing as kind of a project in a restaurant or something. And yeah, it's kind of funny to look at where it all wound up with Microsoft buying them and everything else. Let's just kind of start with the fundamentals here. I did kind of mention that if you have a Mac, you probably know what Homebrew is, but do you want to give people a rundown of what it is?
Sure. So Homebrew is a open source package manager for macOS primarily, and also increasingly Linux as well, interestingly.
Really?
Could talk a little bit more about that later, because that's sometimes confusing to particularly Mac people. But yeah, so basically if you write brew, which is the kind of shorthand, brew install, and then pretty much any application you would want, and you can install that on your Mac. So it's, I believe, we have some degree of evidence that about 30 million people and or bots make use of Homebrew, and it's in our opinion the best way of installing open source software on your Mac. What you may not know as well with Homebrew, it started off just being a building everything from source package manager for open source tools, wget, curl, whatever. Whereas nowadays you can also install upstream binaries. So say Chrome, which I'm a diehard Safari guy, so I'm streaming in Chrome today because I had my usual sadness of learning the website doesn't support Safari. So I fired up Chrome, but I install Chrome by just typing brew, install Google Chrome, and then it sticks everything in my applications folder, sets it all up and all that type of things. And there's a long tail of ecosystems where you can have Brew Bundle is another favorite of mine, where you can have declarative ways of telling Homebrew what to do and all this type of stuff. So yeah, that's basically, and my non-tech explanation of Homebrew is it's a app store for open source in your terminal.
Right. Yeah, you just brew install whatever you want and off it runs and does its thing. In fact, a lot of tutorials, if you need a particular piece of the puzzle, a lot of the gems and things that I use in Ruby, it'll basically say go brew install your blah blah blah, right? And then you can run from there. So yeah, it's definitely something that I use and I reach for, and I don't even think anymore that, oh, gee, somebody actually made this, right? It's just part of life. So anyway, so I'm kind of curious as we kind of get into this a little bit, and there's a lot to talk about, right? Because I do want to get into Workbrew and what that's all about. But before we do that, for those of us who have used Homebrew for a long time and are excited to see maybe where it came from and what all is entailed in it. Where did it come from? You said you weren't in it from necessarily the beginning, but you got a commitment pretty early. So yeah, what's the story there?
I think I got involved about, maybe started using it 4 or 5 months and started contributing pretty short after of when it was first created. It was made in 2009 by a guy called Max Howell, who was in
Uh,
London. I think he was working at Last FM at the time. It's a blast from the past that probably still exists, but
yeah,
not as widely used as it once was. So he had,
I have kids younger than Homebrew.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I also have kids younger than Homebrew. And it's distressing when you meet kids who are the same age as Homebrew and how articulate they are. But so he basically had played around with all the package managers on the Mac at the time. There was Mac ports and Think, and I
Oh
can't remember,
yeah, I remember those. Yeah,
I can't remember what the other one was.
I
But
use
anyway,
Mac ports, but yeah,
yeah, Mac ports was probably the dominant one, and he didn't have a huge amount of like good time using
right.
Mac ports. Felt that it kind of did too much, and he didn't like the approach. So he built Homebrew, which was this kind of beer themed package manager.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, and the
The
other interesting
packages are
model.
still called casks.
Yeah, the packages are still called like formulae and casks, and it's still got all
Uh huh.
the beer themes all over the place. But one of the interesting things he did as well is it was, this was, I can't remember, you would probably know, Charles, actually what year GitHub opened to the public, but certainly this was in 2009. So GitHub was like relatively new. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure when Homebrew first got created, the pull request didn't exist yet. But Max from the outset had decided like, hey, I want to make this thing, but I can't maintain thousands of packages all by myself.
Right.
So I'm going to have to kind of open this up and make it a community effort to do that. So yeah, so that's basically what happened, and more people kind of, particularly in the Ruby community, like I think the Ruby community was one of the early adopters of Homebrew because Homebrew itself was written in, and it still is primarily within Ruby. And yeah, and basically just it kind of grew. More people got involved, more people contributed, and then people who contributed lots and ended up doing a bunch of reviews and stuff like that. I guess folks like me ended up kind of becoming maintainers, and then the project's just sort of grown and grown over the time. So yeah, it went from originally like just Max in 2009 to nowadays we've got I think 30 something maintainers. We probably had like
Wow.
50 total all time, and then we've had like over 10,000 people contribute to some part of the project at least once.
Very cool. So I have so many questions. So one of them is there are kind of a bunch of different pieces to this, right? You've got the command line interface, and then you've got the hey, go grab the thing, and how do I know how to build the thing, and how do I know where to put the thing, and how to right? And so let's just start with the command line interface. So um what tools did you start out working with, and has that changed over the last what 13, 14 years?
Yeah. So Homebrew was written originally exclusively in Ruby, pretty much.
Right.
And it's still primarily Ruby. Like the irony in Homebrew land compared to maybe other bits of Ruby, where because we're like a CLI and because we are installing a bunch of stuff related to compilers and things, but we can't rely
Mhm.
on them necessarily being there. And we haven't wanted to ship native binaries for the application itself. When we want to make things faster in Homebrew, often they are ported from Ruby to Bash. So an increasing amount of
Oh, wow.
the kind of very performance intensive bits of Homebrew, like the bits where like you want to be able to run a command and have a response instantly, or you want
Mhm.
to be able to have a command that you can run every time you open your shell and it not have too much overhead. So some of that, more of that stuff is kind of ported to like Bash and like the updaters in Bash, and because Homebrew installs its own Ruby nowadays because we originally used just the whatever Ruby shipped with macOS, and
Right.
that worked all right for a pretty long time. But I think last year we were speaking to our kind of Apple contacts, and they'd theoretically deprecated Ruby, I think, a few years ago in the system, and we said, "Hey, can we get a newer one?"
I
And
think
they
it's
basically
still
were,
there,
it is still there, but it's a
but it's
2.6
yeah, I
now,
was
which
gonna
is
say
like,
it's not a current version.
yeah, pretty ancient. So yeah, so we ended up we were rolling our own for really old macOS versions and for Linux anyway. So we just like, well, we can roll our own for everyone now and just make it mandatory.
Right.
And I think it's Ruby 3.1 or 2 or something like that
Uh-huh.
nowadays. And yeah, and that's a much nicer experience for us and makes everything a bit faster and snappier and stuff. So yeah, so the main package manager is all in Ruby, and then we have, I guess, two main repositories. So there's like Homebrew Brew, we would call it, which is like
Mhm.
github.com/homebrew/brew. That's the package manager, and that's that's my personal like favorite happy place to live. And I kind of review pretty much every PR that is in that repo. And then there's like Homebrew slash Homebrew core. And so that's
Uh-huh.
like the core formula. Like basically everything in there has to be open source, and there's like 6,000 packages or whatever in there. And that again is, I think, one of the reasons why Ruby was such a good pick originally. Like, is that the like the files that kind of describe how to install something are known as formula.
Uh-huh.
And again, going down the beer theme, and that it's like a really nice Ruby DSL that kind of is, I would say, fairly. If you kind of have a basic understanding of almost like, configure, make, install, like how Unix programs are generally
Hmm.
built, like you can read through that and it's pretty obvious how to get started. And if you've ever had the misfortune of having to try and package like RPMs or like Debian packages or
Hmm.
whatever, which are very, very robust, arguably better than Homebrew once they're there, but like the actual just process of going from nothing to something that works is very time consuming in my experience. Whereas in Homebrew, you can just uh, like make a fairly short little thing and then have yourself up and running, installing applications in a pretty quick time. And I think that's why it's grown and stayed big, because it's quite easy for people to contribute and modify and change things. And it's just, you can do it all on GitHub nowadays.
Right. So when I was in college, I was a systems administrator on mostly Red Hat systems, and so I've written some fugly bash scripts to do all kinds of things, and I've also done the RPM packaging, and later on, there are a few things that I've had to fiddle with and maybe put into a Debian package, and yeah, that is not a fun process. And then you just kind of have to put it out there and then pull it in with your package manager or with some utility that can pull it in and unpack it and do whatever it does. And oh man, yeah,
Yeah.
homebrew's pretty nice that way.
Yeah.
Also done plenty of stuff with Make, which is it's a powerful utility, but it's a little arcane sometimes. And so yeah, I definitely feel you there. So um yeah, so it's all written in Ruby. Is it pretty simple, or are there a lot of edge cases you have to handle, or is that mostly in the packages or the formula or whatever?
Yeah, a bit of both. Like, I mean, I think with stuff like Homebrew, there's like a really long tail. So I guess with the stuff that Max created in the first place, um, I can't remember how many packages he almost like shipped
Mhm.
with to begin with, but it's one of those things where if you have 100 packages, everything seems pretty simple. If you have 1,000, things start to get a bit more complex. And then when you
Right.
start getting up to like 5, 6,000, it's like it gets really messy. All the weird and wonderful things that things do. And as a
Yeah.
packager of software, you have this kind of weird decision framework where there's often the way the people who write the software originally, I guess we would refer to them as upstream. The way they want to release their software is not necessarily the way your users want to consume the software or the way you want to be keeping it up to date and stuff. So you're trying to sort of balance these things. And yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, the thing I've enjoyed about it personally is like I've always been a bit of a kind of generalist software ride. So like with Ruby, particularly when I was doing a lot more of the packaging stuff than I do probably today, in a given week, you could be writing Ruby, C, C++, Haskell, like having to play around with like 10, 20 different languages and frameworks. And you kind of develop a sense of how this stuff plays nicely together and what the edge cases are and what you need to watch out for and everything like that. But yeah, I mean, software is a wily beast, and
Yeah.
packaging it's no less so.
Interesting. So, yeah. So what are your dependencies? I know that you have to have the Xcode build tools installed. Does it pull
Yes.
in the rest of them for me?
Yeah, basically that's the on a Mac, like that's all you need. You just need to have the Xcode like utilities installed.
Mhm.
And then even then, like we've sort of tried in the past, like sometimes to make them not required, but it's pretty hard given like the state of
Right.
things in Apple land to go completely without that. And every few years Apple introduces some new requirement which requires using a CLI that only they provide, and there's no open source version, and
Mhm.
we're kind of back to square one there. So yeah, basically just the Xcode command line tools are the only dependency. And then if you're running Homebrew on Linux, there's a few other bits and pieces there. But the big one I mentioned before, like Ruby, like we build our own kind of statically compiled
Right.
Ruby, which you can just use anywhere that's auto installed for you and everything.
So I guess some of the something else that I'm wondering is, are you taking advantage of some of the newer features in Ruby? So, for example, you've got YJIT, right, that speeds things up quite a bit, or the other one is like Fiber Scheduler and stuff like that, which gives you some level of concurrency. Are you digging into any of that, or is that kind of upcoming when you get to it?
Yeah, so we've played around with like bits and pieces around there. Like, so it's funny because Homebrew is very much, there's been this kind of meme in the Ruby community for a while that like people get sad that like Ruby is associated almost entirely with Rails most of the time.
Hmm.
And like Homebrew is pretty much as far away from that as you can get. And that,
Right.
we're not even a web app. We're not attached to a database. Like you're running a CLI. So it's funny. I guess a lot of the places from where the JITs come from, like never say never, like it may well make things faster in the future, but right now all of the kind of different JITs we've tried and the different JIT sessions we've tried, like just the way Homebrew runs, even if it's doing a relatively complex task, like the run times are relatively short, the process only sticks around
Right.
for, at most probably a few minutes. But then a lot of the time it's just around for a second, and there's new data every time, so you can't
Uh,
necessarily cache things super hard. And like basically everywhere where Homebrew is slow, and like that's the most common complaint about Homebrew is that Homebrew is slow. The Almost everywhere it's slow because of the like IO. Basically, like we're either downloading
uh-huh.
something off the internet, we're writing something to your hard drive, we're reading something from your hard drive, whatever. And we could maybe do a little bit more parallelization, but again, like in the past, there's been times where and again, some of this may be changing from splitting platters to SSDs or whatever. There's been times where I've ripped out parallelized code that we have in Homebrew, and it's actually dramatically faster running
Right.
serially than it is parallel. So yeah, I mean, we definitely have a decent amount of like profiling tools. Like we rely on like
Hmm.
stack, but basically everything you would expect in Ruby land, stack prof, coprof, all these types of things. Um, but yeah, but we do try and make things as fast as we can, and the JITs don't seem to really be helping much for us at the moment. But as I say, maybe
No,
in
that makes
future.
sense. Yeah. So, I'm gonna move on a little bit to, you mentioned Homebrew Core. So is
Yep.
that the list of casks and formulae?
So Homebrew Core is the list of formula. So we have Homebrew Cask and Homebrew Core. So the difference between casks and formula are like Homebrew Cask used to be its own like separate project, and
Mhm.
that's what you use for installing like binaries from other people. So like
Right.
say like Google Chrome or 1Password or whatever. Like if you're installing that, basically if the project is, whether it's open source or not, if the main way that that's delivered is like a pre-compiled thing or like a .app or DMG or
Uh-huh.
.pkg or whatever, then you're installing that with Homebrew Cask. Like the essentially to the user, the interface is more or less the same nowadays. Like you type brew install Google Chrome or brew install wget, and
Mhm.
it looks essentially transparent under the hood. But
Right.
yeah, they're managed in separate repos. Like this was previously like a requirement due to some open source political nonsense. But yeah, so everything in Homebrew Core is open source software, and
Right.
everything. And Homebrew Cask has a much looser requirement basically there. So yeah, they're managed separately. They have roughly the same number of packages, but then like again, the DSL that's used are kind of slightly different. And
Mhm.
Homebrew Cask is a bit more friendly to like proprietary software for GUIs, whatever. And then Homebrew Core is a bit more friendly to like CLIs and is open source software.
I gotcha. So, yeah, and see, I didn't even know you could install some of those binaries with Homebrew, because I always just go to the website and download it and run the installer and right,
Yeah.
or open the DMG and drag it to applications or whatever. So that's really interesting. As you get into some of the open source stuff in particular, how do you know how to build it? Are you always looking for the make file, or is there something else to it? Or
So sometimes there's instructions in like a GitHub repo or whatever, or sometimes there's kind of, it's got a make file, and sometimes you're just trying to try it out and figure it out, and hopefully you can do the right thing. And then 2 years later, the author pops up and they say, "Hey, you've been building this totally wrong." And it's like, well, you, you didn't tell us what to do, dude. So like that's what's going to happen.
yeah,
So yeah, it's always a like. there's definitely like a certain amount of kind of trends and traits of things that behave pretty similarly, and those projects are very nice to deal with. And then there's projects who decide, hey, I'm going to invent my own build system because all the other ones suck.
Mhm.
And yeah, those are less fun to deal with.
Right. So, essentially, if I do a brew install on something like Google Chrome, it's just gonna pull the binary off of wherever, and it's gonna put it wherever it goes and make sure it's in my path or whatever it has to do in order for me to be able to run it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and then for a formula, it's gonna go through some kind of build process, and it sounds like you don't like auto detect the build script. You go and you look it up and you add that to the formula and tell it how to build it.
Yeah, exactly. So what we try and do like certain bits of auto detection, and for an end user, for the if you're running brew install on your machine, the experience is actually kind of similar because you're still
Mhm.
downloading a binary most of the time. If you installed Homebrew on like a supported macOS version, which is one of the last three and the kind of default location,
Right.
then what it will do is essentially when someone submits a formula or an update to a formula, we have our pull requests on GitHub, our continuous integration. We'll go and like build that, and then when that works, we then have a process that kind of that build artifact gets uploaded. We call those like bottles, the binary
Mhm.
packages in
Okay.
Homebrews. Like that. That was my probably favorite contribution to Homebrew, was doing that, just for the amount of time it's probably saved the world. Because
Oh, yeah.
before that, if you wanted to install wget, it would take 5 minutes, and everyone would essentially spend 5 minutes with their CPU fans. In the days before Apple
Right.
Silicon, like going at 100% to spit out essentially the same binary at the end. So yeah, now we kind of have these binary packages, and those are downloaded onto your machine and installed, and it's all
I
nice and quick.
gotcha.
And also it's way less error prone because with the compilation stuff, there's always things where you have some random utility on your machine, and the build script detects that and then blows up or whatever. So you don't have
Mhm.
those same issues with the binaries.
Right. So it looks at my setup and says, "Oh, I know that this bottle's compatible, so I'm just gonna give you the binary instead of making you build it."
Totally.
And then if it can't for whatever reason, then it'll do the build step or the build process?
Yeah, yeah. I mean that essentially should never happen on a supported Mac and a supported
Right.
location. But yeah, if you're outside of that, then it will fall back to kind of building from source when it can't do that otherwise. But yeah, but most things most of the time will always be you get
Hmm.
like a binary package for most users. So
Right. So, just backing up a little bit because you mentioned Homebrew Core and Homebrew Casks as
yeah,
kind of the places where these things live. Is Homebrew literally going to GitHub and cloning it, or like
yeah.
how does it
So
get that list?
yeah, originally, well, until very recently, yes, we did that to
That's so
GitHub's.
wild.
Yeah, so the original updater for Homebrew was just, it had one repo, which was like MXCL, which is Max Howell's GitHub,
Uh-huh.
MXCL/Homebrew, and that would just be cloned in a directory. And when you ran brew update to like pull the latest packages, that was just doing a git pull basically. So over time, that became more and more sophisticated. As Homebrew grew, that became slower and slower. Like even
Right.
the no op operation of just doing a git fetch on that repo and it's telling you
Uh-huh.
you don't need anything, that was taking like a couple of seconds. At the time, I worked at GitHub and I was getting annoyed with how slow it was. So I actually added a entry to the GitHub API to specifically to make Homebrew's updates faster. And like it ended up being used by a bunch of other cases and package managers or whatever.
Right.
Essentially, what you could do is you could just like pass the hash that you have. I
Uh-huh.
abused the what's it called, the HTTP eat tag, so you could
Uh-huh.
pass the git commit hash as the e tag, and then you would get a whatever, I can't remember what it is, the status code that says not modified essentially. So it would
Right.
do that, and it also wouldn't count against your GitHub rate limit because that was very heavily cached, that operation. So that basically meant you could get a really really fast response for like GitHub repos, and we still rely on that API to this day. And yeah, so until very recently, like that was still how it was done, and we would like fetch stuff or whatever. But over time that was getting slower and slower, and also like GitHub were like, they were pretty nice about it all, but I think at some point I believe there was like a dedicated bare metal server that was essentially just 24/7 serving Homebrew core to people, because also the way that repo had super long history, loads of contributors,
Right.
did a lot of like squash and rebasing, so like not very kind like history management,
Oh
and again,
yeah.
like thousands of files in a folder, which we never knew when Homebrew was created, is extreme. If you have very deep histories, Git gets very angry and the performance goes to bad places pretty quick. So yeah, so as of, I think it was a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, like one of the Homebrew maintainers kind of started a first attempt at like a little project to see about, okay, well, you can effectively turn pretty much all the Homebrew packages into like JSON output anyway.
Right.
And when you're just downloading binary packages, you're basically just downloading a thing off the internet and sticking it in, like installing it that way anyway. You don't need all the kind of sophisticated build information for every package.
Mm-hmm.
So as of like about a year ago, I think we've migrated entirely to what we call our kind of JSON API, which is downloading just a single JSON file which provides all the details for those packages, and then you just have that single download. You don't need to have that Git repository on your machine anymore, which saves a bunch of space, and it's like a lot quicker with downloading.
Right.
And yeah, and the implementation of that API is another disgusting thing where, so perhaps because I'm Scottish and we are known for such things, or just, I don't know. I don't like paying for things, and in open source projects, I
I
like
think
paying for
that's
things
universal.
even less. So our JSON API is actually on GitHub pages, and
Oh, cool.
so it's all like, it's a statically generated API essentially. So like every 15 minutes we like regenerate our package list, and what that
Huh.
means is that it's really, really, really fast and essentially nigh infinitely scalable for GitHub to stick a CDN
Right.
in front of that and host it that way. And it's also pretty easy for us to kind of download and debug, and we're not maintaining some like complex, like when I worked on the API at GitHub, like maintaining the performance on that thing when you were at the scales we were at was not an easy feat. And I saw that, I guess, for Homebrew, and I was like, nope, I'm gonna, if I can make this just an entirely static, unauthenticated API, then let's do that. So that's the route we went down, and it's been working pretty well for us.
That's awesome. I love that. It also makes me think a little bit that sometimes I might be overcomplicating my life by trying to make it work the other way, right? The more traditional, I'm going to build an endpoint on Rails, and it's going to give all this stuff, and it's going to check all these things, instead of just saying, hey, it doesn't matter if everybody knows this, and it'll be way faster, and it's not that big a file. So yeah, just go get it.
Yeah, it's funny because I had this idea for like over a decade about like building essentially static APIs, where, because
Uh-huh.
like static site, I've used like Jekyll and GitHub Pages for my
Oh yeah.
homepage for a long time, and I kind of like that sort of static site builder model, and the results are nice and super fast, and it's really cheap and easy to host and very non-error prone. Right, once you've generated the files, you're like, well, nothing can go wrong now, right? Compared to
Yeah.
like maintaining a Rails app. But yeah, so I always kind of liked the idea of having a static API, and I was pleased that I was actually finally able to do it, because in cases where essentially you want to deliver the data to absolutely everyone, the data is the same, it's not like user dependent or
Mhm.
whatever, and the data only needs updated like not very often, like you're not updating like second by second from some database,
Right.
but you're updating it like a few times an hour. Then yeah, like this approach has actually been really quite cool and fun, and yeah, I'd encourage others to play it out. Although uh, play around with the approach, and maybe not on GitHub Pages, because GitHub might be angry with me. So
Well, I can imagine though, because I'm just thinking through maybe what I want to do with building an app for the podcast network, right?
yeah,
And yeah, like 99% of the stuff that I'm putting out there, it's going to be the same for everybody, and it's all public, and right. So I don't have to protect it at all. And so, yeah, why not just have a static file out there that it can just go, oh, you want the list of podcasts here, right? Oh, you want this podcast and all of its episodes here, right? Now, granted, some of the podcasts have more than 500 episodes at this point, and so You might get a little longer JSON file, but still it's not terribly large. And you start getting into it really when you start pulling down images or audio files. But
Yep.
I can put those in as URLs on the JSON and just make it really wicked fast. And then it's okay. Now I have restricted access for memberships and stuff like that. That's where I can, maybe put a check in front of it, but still then just have them pick up a statically generated thing, because once you're authenticated, that's all the same too. So
Yep. Totally.
I'm
Totally.
really digging this.
Yeah, it's been fun. I think I don't know that this is the thing I like about working on open source and stuff like Homebrew is that you get. I guess the thing I've learned in my career is the most interesting projects are the ones often with any sort of
Uh-huh.
constraints, right? Like the projects with like take as long as you want, you have as many people as you want, do it whatever you want in whatever language you want.
Yeah.
Like they're often like maybe I'm just a masochist, but I find them often like less fun. Whereas the fun thing with something like Homebrew as well is like you're building Homebrew's API, and it's like, well, we have like I guess the way I describe Homebrew's financial situation is like not enough to pay anyone, but too much for stickers, right? So you have
Right.
like this like middle ground of money,
Mm-hmm.
and as a result, like it's this tricky thing of like, well, I don't really want to put us in a situation where we're paying vast hosting bills. So let's try and figure out a way of doing this for free, essentially. But it has to be able to scale to like, you know, millions, if not tens of millions of people like using this thing. So yeah, so like that's been a fun kind of comparison
Mm-hmm.
compared to, as I say, like GitHub days where you're scaling to many more people than that, but you also have particularly post Microsoft acquisition, like many more resources at your disposal in order to achieve those scales. And you're not worrying
Yep.
quite as much about the bottom line as you go along.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I just went through my head was, and this isn't JSON, it's XML, but RSS feeds, right?
Oh yeah,
Same
yeah,
deal. Yeah.
yep.
So yeah. Um, all right. So we've kind of talked through how the repository works, and um, let's say that I decided I wanted to build the CLI and it was moderately complex. Are there things that you recommend to me as a Ruby developer as places to get started?
Um, I mean, the funny thing is, I wasn't, I realized this maybe um, I don't know, a controversial take for the podcast, but like, I mean, nowadays I probably wouldn't necessarily reach for Ruby for a CLI. Like it's okay for like doing, I still think it's great for doing web apps, but like, when
Uh-huh.
I've been building like a new CLI for some of the stuff we've been doing with Workbrew, and like Go feels like a more, I was basically weighing up between like Go, Rust, and Swift, basically, as
Oh, okay.
like the
Swift. I
options.
wouldn't have pegged Swift for that, but
Well, I didn't peg Swift in the end for various reasons, but I ended up going with Go, which it's I don't know, like for me, Go is just it's good at what it does. It's such a boring
mhm.
language. I don't have any fun when I'm writing Go, but you can ship a single static
Oh, it's wicked
binary
fast. Yeah.
and it's super fast. And for CLIs, like it's like the responsiveness is really great. I think that's the thing. That maybe I'm just burned for like 15 years of working on a Ruby CLI, but like there's a certain amount of people who will complain about the slowness. That it's like literally even like a Ruby interpreter spinning up and saying "Hello World" is like
Mhm.
unacceptably slow to some people, right? And at that level, I can't really do anything to make it
Right.
faster. But I guess if you are going down the route of almost like really wanting to get into make it some sort of Ruby CLI or whatever, I guess I would just say like the beauty of Ruby is that you can start with like a single script, right? You can just
Right.
have a script, stick the shebang at the top. Like for those who don't know, that's the thing where it has like exclamation mark, hash, like user bin. Oh, it's the other way
Yeah.
around. Anyway, like user bin Ruby or whatever, and then you can just start writing Ruby code straight away, right?
Mhm.
And like that's how I think is the best way to maybe get started with like CLIs, or whatever. It's just like rather than almost like reaching for some option parsing framework or whatever. No, just go and just start writing some Ruby and
Right.
just read the argv, which is the array of like the arguments you
Mhm.
pass into the script, and like just read that yourself and just don't go too fast too quickly, and you'll probably have like a good time. Because again, like when you're CLIs, if you wanted to distribute them to other people, like if they, if you start relying on loads of other gems and stuff, then it becomes like a little bit more of a headache to kind of distribute and use these things and keep them up to date and whatever. So like, yeah, I think the beauty of Ruby is like Ruby has like a pretty decent broad standard
Hmm.
library. You could do a lot with like a single script, and even like an old version of Ruby, like the ones that ship with like macOS, like they're still, it's still a powerful, like pleasant language to work in. So
Yep. Very cool. So yeah, so is there anything new coming in Homebrew or
yeah, I mean, we're
stable?
always working on, but it's funny because people ask periodically about like the roadmap for Homebrew, and because we're essentially, I mean, maybe except for me now, like essentially almost everyone is like a volunteer. The roadmap for Homebrew is kind of like, well, let's see
Whatever
what
you have
people
time
want
for.
to, whatever people want to work on, right? And it's
Yeah.
like the product management on Homebrew kind of looks more like nerds attempting to nerd snipe other maintainers into solving problems than it does like building a team and assigning them a 6-month project or
Right.
whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think like a big thing is like performance. Like we're continually trying to kind of eke out better performance where we can. And then yeah, and I guess like I'm looking at it from the kind of Workbrew end as well of being like, okay, well, so if me and a team of people are actually able to work on Homebrew full time, or like spend like a decent amount of our time putting into Homebrew, like what are the really
Hmm.
big, impactful things in Homebrew that kind of might people might look at and say that's just impossible that we could do if we have like a paid team of people who are working on this stuff full time. And I don't want to, I don't want to be too spoilery with that, but yeah, there's definitely some stuff we're exploring where if we see that there's interest and we can kind of pull it off, I think people will really say wow about. But
Right.
in the short to medium term, I think there's more along the lines of yeah, just like making Homebrew faster, more secure, making the contribution process better, and just trying to do everything we do right now like better, basically. Like, I mean, I'm a big fan at GitHub and on Homebrew of like when I was at GitHub, that was like leaning really, really heavily into automation. So again, like
Hmm.
a lot of what we're trying to do on Homebrew sometimes is like we've only got 30 people maintaining the project, but yeah, the throughput of like PRs we have and is fairly ridiculous, and we just try and have so much automation, lean more and more and more heavily into that. And any time I catch people doing things that I'm like a bot could do this, then it's like right, I try and write some code and get the humans doing the human things and save the bot
Yep.
work for the bots.
So I was going to ask about Workbrew, and I'm going to ask about it in a second. But you did mention
Yeah,
maintainers, and so if
yeah.
somebody is like, "Oh, I've got a great idea for Homebrew," or I use this all the time, and I'd like to contribute back to it, right? Is there a good way for people to get started with contributing back
Yeah.
to Homebrew?
So Homebrew, the best way to get started is there's like a contribution section on the README of the Homebrew brew
Uh huh.
repo. So if you go there, then you'll, or if you even just search for like contributing to Homebrew, like results are pretty decent. I would say our docs are probably like on the better end for like contribution. Like our tooling's probably pretty good, but like I would say like it's a really easy project to get started with, and we really try to kind of cheerlead the people who want to get involved with the project. So
Hmm.
like if you're in any doubt, just try something and we'll help you out. And you can mention me by my GitHub handle or whatever if you say that it's your first PR and you're struggling, and I'll try and do what I can to help you and stuff like that. It's a yeah, as I say, I think it's a really good project to kind of get started with. But as for some of us at least, it's also can be fairly addictive at times. So um, be be wary from that perspective as well.
Yep. All right. So the other question I have then is, yeah, do you want to talk about Workbrew, like what it is and where
Yeah,
you're heading with that?
yeah. So I mean, as I mentioned earlier with like Homebrew, like I've been working on Homebrew for about 15 years, and for probably 10 of those years, there's been people who have been encouraging me at various points to, oh, you should make a company doing stuff around Homebrew. And I have been historically kind of down on this idea or fairly cynical, particularly when, I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but there's been various companies who kind of have done open source stuff, and then they complain down the line when everyone uses their software, but they're not making enough money or whatever it may be. And
Right.
I guess to me, it's like open source itself is not a business model, and also like I kept, like you mentioned earlier, like you've got, kids younger than Homebrew and stuff. Like I also feel like Homebrew is kind of my first child, and I feel quite precious of it, and I wouldn't want
Uh-huh.
to, you know, like destroy it or whatever. So it took a while for me to get to a place that I was like, yeah, actually, it feels like a few things have come together. So one is like Homebrew feels. I mean, even with the roadmap stuff, like if we'd had this conversation a year ago or 2 years ago, I probably would have said like more stuff on the horizon. But it feels like fairly close to kind of feature complete at this point,
Hmm.
without almost like a big injection of kind of effort and stuff. So that was one part. The other part is like I won't go into all the boring details of like open source governance, but we have an open collective. We have a leadership committee. We have elections every year. We have like ways of getting involved with the project beyond just like code and docs and stuff like that. We have money that we're using to like provide stipends to some maintainers and pay for them to kind of come and meet each other in person and stuff. So the project feels like it's in a really good, mature place. And it's also in a place where no one party could ever kind of completely take over Homebrew, even if they wanted
Right.
to. And it's also on the backdrop of this, I guess, like, I left GitHub last year and was sort of looking for a new challenge and something new. And, again, over the last 10 years, there's been various times where companies come and say, hey, we'd like, Homebrew to do this or that or whatever. And essentially what a lot of Homebrew features come down to is like, do the volunteers who are mainly working in their spare time want to build and support this?
Right.
And for a lot of like big enterprise stuff, I don't know, Charles, if you ever had the misfortune of reading through like a SAML spec or something like that before, but once you get into this like big enterprise tech, like it's often not very fun, and it's not what people
Right.
want to spend their evenings and weekends doing. And I previously worked like before my Homebrew days in like an open source company back when I was a KDE contributor, and this
Mm.
company, a consulting company, and they hired more KDE contributors than anyone else. And I worked there, and I thought, sweet, I'm going to be able to work on open source most of the time. But I learned pretty quickly that their open source projects were actually not super fun, because they were basically
Right.
stuff that people would pay a consulting company to go and like, hey, like we've got this stuff which we can't get anyone to do for fun. So will you do this for money? And then they're like, okay, well, fine. So with Workbrew, I kind of see it as being a similar thing, where what we're trying to do is, there's a lot of talk about sustainability and open source and stuff right now. And I guess that's on my mind. I worked on the original team of people who built GitHub sponsors and have helped kind of Homebrew
Yeah.
have that open collective. And to me, like this is the next almost like step in the evolution of like what sustainability could look like for Homebrew, is having a commercial entity where we're trying to kind of make a sustainable like commercial entity who has an interest in making money in the Homebrew ecosystem, but
Hmm.
not charging money directly for Homebrew itself. Homebrew itself
Right.
is and will always remain like free of charge. But we're going to make Homebrew better by making Workbrew better and be providing services to companies in the Homebrew ecosystem through our expertise and by building stuff that tightly integrates with Homebrew. So essentially, the version of Workbrew that I like run on my local machine today, it looks and behaves almost exactly the same as Homebrew,
Right.
except it's got a little coffee cup instead of a beer emoji. But it's running in a different way. It's running in a more isolated like fashion, a multi-user fashion.
Right.
It's like reporting back to do fleet management, so someone could upgrade like if I've got critical vulnerabilities remotely, and so that people can see kind of, oh, like um, you haven't updated in 6 months and we've got
Hmm.
some problems with that, whatever it may be. So essentially that's what we've tried to do. We're trying to build something that provides a better experience for using Homebrew at work. um, but for most hobbyists, I mean, we very much have the goal that if you, in 5 or 10 years, if we're successful, even if you've never heard of Workbrew, even if you never interact with Workbrew, you will look at essentially roundabout now as being an inflection point where Homebrew gets really, really good in the next 5 or 10 years, and it gets noticeably better for everyone using it, because we're able to kind of get involved and improve the sustainability of the project through the commercialization of this part of the ecosystem.
That's cool. If people want to know a little bit more about what's going on with that, like, do you have a mailing list or something, or are you
Yeah,
keeping people
so
up to date somehow?
yeah, the best way of like getting in touch with us, we've got a contact form on our website. If you go to workbrew.com/contact, then you can like send us a wee message, and then we can go and get in touch, and we'll kind of send you emails and stuff like that. And you can also see, if you go to workbrew.com, our demo of what we have in private beta right now, which is essentially like fleet management for Homebrew and kind of integrating with
Hmm.
MDM tools, so that basically like Mac admins and primarily, and security professionals, developer experience folks can basically get a nicer experience of using Homebrew at work. So yeah, so we're recruiting like design partners for that right now, which essentially means like people who will give us lots of feedback while we make the beta kind of more to their requirements. So again, if you're interested in that, best way is reaching out through the contact form. And if you have any thoughts, equally as well, if it's easier, if you're one of these people who gets spooked by contact forms, you can send me an email. My email address is pretty easily findable on the internet. So if you do that, or it's just mike@workbrew.com or at brew.sh if you want my open source email.
Awesome. All right. Well, if people want to connect with you on some other level, where do they find you on the internet?
So I'm basically read only, mainly on Twitter nowadays. I'm Mike McQuaid on there, but the best place probably is I'm Mike McQuaid at mastodon.social on like Mastodon
Okay.
nowadays. Or if you just find my website at mikemcquaid.com, that's basically got, I try and kind of put, if I write blog posts or like do talks, and all my contact information is there and stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. And you'd be surprised how few people actually just email me to say hi or share their opinions. So feel free to do that for almost anything except for saying my Homebrew's broken, please fix it. In which case, open an issue.
Right. All right, good deal. Well, I'm going to go ahead and roll us into the picks here. And we usually have the host go first, so I'll go first. One of the first picks I have, I always pick a board game when I do my picks, and so I'm going to pick a board game called Fire Tower. And basically, it was a relatively simple game. Let me look it up on Board Game Geek real quick while I tell you how it's played. But essentially, all of the players have fire towers in the corners of the board, and so what you're trying to do is you're trying to burn everybody else's tower down before the fire gets to and burns your tower down. And so you can play 2 to 4 players. We played it with 4 people. It was a lot of fun. Board Game Geek rates it a 1.77. I tell people that a 2 is kind of a reasonably complicated game. It's complicated to be fun, but not so complicated that it's hard to pick up. And so, yeah, this is right in there at that level. Playing time, it says 15 to 30 minutes. I think we played it 45, but it was our first time. 10 plus player or 10 plus on age. I honestly think my 8-year-old could play this game, right? It's pretty simple, and after she played it once or twice, she'd probably get most of the strategies figured out, right? Don't have the wind blow toward your tower. Put down the fire tokens in a way that gets it closer to the other people's towers. I mean, right? Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that. It was a super fun game. Really enjoyed it. One other one that I'm going to pick is, we were talking about some of the install stuff, and Daniel Kehoe, who's used to be in the Ruby community way back in the day, he has a website, mac.install.guide, and it walks through how to install like Ruby and a bunch of other stuff, and it pretty heavily refers people to Homebrew. So anyway, I'm going to refer to that just as a resource that people can go check out. And then I had something else, and I'm just kind of blanking on it. Anyway, the where I talked to Daniel most recently was when I picked up the railscomposer.com domain from him. And so I'm working on that. You can actually watch me build Rails Composer and all of the different Rails engines that I plan on putting together for that on the Rails Clips video series. So just go to topenddevs.com and you can find it. I think I also own railsclips.com, and I think that goes to the right place. So go check that out. But anyway, yeah, good stuff. Mike, what do you want to pick on the show?
Yeah, okay. I guess I will do 3 little picks. So one would be, I'm reading a book right now by a guy called Alistair Reynolds, and he's a science fiction author. He's written a lot of kind of space opera stuff. read all of his books that he's ever written so far, and he released a new one a couple of months ago, which I'm 88% of
Nice.
the way through, called Machine Vendetta. Penny Arcade talked about it, and you probably don't want to jump straight into Machine Vendetta, as there's been a couple of books preceding it in the series, unless you want to deal with the discussion of hyperpigs in the first paragraph, which may throw you off. My second recommendation would be a band. You may or may not be into their vibe. They're called Alestorm, like a storm of beer. I guess you can see there's a theme going on. They are a Scottish pirate metal band. I'm seeing them live next Sunday in Scotland, but they play internationally. My kids really like a song from their latest album called Pirate Party, because it has a moment with a man drinking from a shoe, which is apparently very funny when you're 4 and 6 years old. But generally, I would not recommend most of their songs to children, as they are very heavily expletive ridden in some of them. But whatever, they may work for you or not. And my final recommendation, I guess, on the theme of open source maintenance in particular, is therapy. I've been doing therapy intermittently since 2020, and I've found tremendously helpful personally, with all sorts of things in work, personal life, my relationships with my friends, family, kids, wife, and even on occasion I have sessions where I talk about a particular difficult person I'm dealing with open source land in a given therapy session. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend it. And I've written a blog post on my website of like a step-by-step guide, if that's your way of doing things, of like how to find a therapist. So if you are interested and that's useful to you, please consider doing that.
Oh man, given the last few months that I've had, I might need that. Anyway, what was the name of the band again? And if you can put a link into the comments, that'd be great.
Yeah. I will drop a link into the band. Let me see.
But yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. One other thing I was just going to put out there, this is the thing I forgot, is that my contract work has slowed down a bit. So if you're looking, I'm either looking for a full-time job or a contract, prefer contract, but if you've got an interesting set of problems and you're going to pay me well to fix them, then I am happy to consider full-time work. You can just email me, chuck@topenddevs.com. All right. Thanks for coming, Mike. This was really, really interesting.
Thanks for having me, Chuck, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Max out, everybody.